June 4, 1942. The dawn cracked open over the Pacific like a slow explosion of molten gold. Aboard the USS Hornet, the air was thick with aviation fuel, salt, and the kind of silence that only exists before a storm. Deck crews moved like shadows, tightening straps, refueling lines, checking propellers. The ocean stretched into forever, blue, endless, deceptive. For the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, it was the last horizon they would ever see. George Henry Gay Jr., just 24, stood beside his worn-out TBD Devastator, a machine the world already considered obsolete. He ran a gloved hand along the fuselage, feeling the dents and patches of oil-stained metal. It wasn't courage that kept his hands steady. It was habit. He'd done this 100 times in training, but this morning felt heavier, like the sky itself was holding its breath. His crewman and radio man, George Field, gave him a quiet nod from the rear seat. No words, just the look of two men who knew the odds. The Devastator had a top speed of barely 200 miles an hour. The Japanese Zero could fly circles around it at twice that speed. Even some of their own officers called the torpedo bombers flying coffins. Gay had heard it all before. They'll never make it back. One mechanic had whispered the night before. We're sending them to die. Gay smiled when he heard that. Then we'll die trying, he'd said simply. He wasn't reckless, he was proud. He believed in his squadron, in their commander John Waldron, and in the quiet idea that sometimes doing your duty meant walking straight into fire. The briefing that morning was brutal in its honesty. Lieutenant Commander Waldron gathered the men in the ready room, his face pale under the fluorescent light. "Gentlemen, we're going in low," he said. "Real low, straight at the carriers. No escort, no tricks." He let that hang in the air for a moment. Everyone knew what it meant. No fighter cover. No protection against Japan's air superiority. It was a one-way trip. Someone muttered, "Hell of a plan." Waldron didn't flinch. "It's the only plan we've got." Then, softer, "Remember what we're fighting for. Remember the men we lost at Pearl." That word Pearl hit like a gunshot. For 6 months, the Pacific had been a graveyard of American pride. The Japanese Navy had swept across the ocean like a storm, seizing the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Their carriers were ghosts, untouchable, deadly, efficient. The world thought Japan unbeatable. Midway was supposed to be the proof. But intelligence had given the U.S. a sliver of a chance. Cryptographers at Pearl Harbor had cracked parts of the Japanese code, revealing that AF meant Midway. Admiral Nimitz placed his carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, right in the path of the enemy. 3 American decks against 4 Japanese. Still, everyone knew the truth. Whoever found the other first would win. And so, on that humid June morning, George Gay strapped himself into a plane designed for an earlier war and prepared to fly into history. The deck officer's hand went up, signaling readiness. Engines roared. The first Devastator rolled forward, wings trembling under the strain. When Gay's turn came, he tightened his harness and looked once toward the sea. "Let's make it halfway in style," he murmured. The launch was violent. Metal screamed. Wind tore at his helmet. The ocean rushed toward him before the plane caught lift and clawed into the sky. Behind him, Field managed to grin. The formation climbed to a few thousand feet, then leveled out. The radio crackled with coded chatter as they set course, heading northwest, straight toward the enemy fleet. Inside the cockpit, everything was vibration and noise. The old Pratt and Whitney engine coughed and sputtered. Sweat rolled down Gay's neck as the temperature climbed. He glanced at his fuel gauge, then at the sea below. The vastness was hypnotic. No land, no ships, just a moving mirror of blue. He thought of home, of Texas heat and open fields. He thought of how absurd it was that all of human history might turn on a few dozen men flying outdated machines over an empty ocean. Hours later, faint smoke trails appeared on the horizon. Waldron's voice came over the radio. "Enemy sighted. Prepare for attack." Gay's pulse spiked. He adjusted his course, checking his torpedo release system one last time. Ahead, shimmering in the sunlight, were the 4 Japanese carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the heart of Japan's naval might. They looked almost peaceful from a distance, like floating cities. But the peace was an illusion. As the Americans descended, Japanese lookouts spotted them. Sirens screamed across the fleet. In seconds, the sky turned black with anti-aircraft bursts. Columns of flak tore through the formation. The sea erupted with geysers as shells detonated. Gay's plane shook violently, fragments slicing past the canopy. Zeros appeared sleek, fast, silver shapes diving from above. The first Devastator in line exploded midair. Then another. Waldron's voice cut through the chaos. "We'll go straight in. Keep formation." His words vanished under gunfire. Gay saw tracer rounds stitching the sky around him. One hit his wing. Another ripped through the fuselage. Field fired back with the rear gun, shouting something lost in the engine noise. The Devastators pressed on, each one releasing its torpedo before being swallowed by smoke. One by one they fell, flaming debris spiraling into the sea. Gay held the control stick firm, guiding his burning aircraft toward the Kaga. The deck below was alive with motion. Planes launching, sailors scrambling, machine guns blazing. A round tore through the cockpit, shattering glass. Hot wind and oil sprayed his face. The plane was on fire now, the metal popping with heat. Still, he didn't pull up. He released his torpedo and watched it drop, slicing into the waves and streaking toward the enemy. Seconds later, flak tore through his tail. The Devastator began to roll. "Hang on, Field," he shouted. But there was no answer. The rear seat was silent. The impact with the ocean was brutal. The plane hit the water at full speed, flipping nose first, tearing apart on contact. Gay was thrown forward, barely conscious. When he surfaced, oil and debris surrounded him. The air stank of gasoline and salt. Flames burned across the water. He tore off his life vest and clung to a floating seat cushion, the only thing between him and the abyss. All around, wreckage bobbed silently. No movement, no voices, just the sound of distant engines and crackling fire. He was alone. 30 men had launched that morning. None had returned. As he floated, watching the Japanese destroyers circle like sharks, Gay thought of his squadron, of Waldron's steady voice, of Field's grin, of the way they'd all believed, even knowing the truth. He pressed himself under the cushion, using it as camouflage, praying they wouldn't see him. Above, the Japanese fleet continued to maneuver, unaware that one wounded American pilot was still alive among the wreckage, watching everything. He could see the carriers turning, launching planes, the sky above them clean now, no more American attackers. For a moment, it seemed the battle was over, their mission a total failure. But history was turning quietly, invisibly, just beyond his view. By drawing the Japanese air cover down to sea level, Torpedo 8 had left the sky open. High above the clouds, unseen and undisturbed, the U.S. dive bombers were coming. George Gay didn't know it yet, but his doomed flight, mocked, dismissed, and destroyed, had just set the stage for one of the most decisive victories in naval history. He would live long enough to see the irony play out, that sometimes the ones who fall first are the reason anyone else can stand at all. George Gay floated for hours, the ocean rocking him like a cradle made of steel and silence. Beneath the cushion that hid him from the Japanese lookouts, his body trembled from shock. His burns stung with salt, his tongue swelled from thirst, and every muscle ached from the crash. But his mind was alive, restless, flickering with memories of how they'd come to this moment. Before the fire, before the fall, before the sky turned black. He thought back to the months before Midway, when Torpedo Squadron 8 had trained on Oahu. Back then, the war still seemed far away, a series of headlines and radio reports. The pilots were young, ambitious, and eager to prove themselves. The problem was the planes. The TBD Devastator had been designed in the mid-1930s, an old, slow relic of a different era. In war games, the newer fighters laughed them out of the sky. During training runs, they could barely keep formation in rough weather. Gay remembered the vibration in the wings, the oil leaks, the torpedoes that misfired half the time. He'd complained once to a senior officer after a failed practice run. "Sir, these things are death traps," he said, wiping oil from his goggles. The officer, a man with graying hair and too many medals, just grunted. "A good pilot makes the plane, son, not the other way around." That line stuck with him. It was supposed to sound like wisdom, but it felt like denial. Everyone knew the Japanese were flying newer, faster machines. The A6M0 was already legendary, light, agile, deadly. Yet the Navy's top brass seemed trapped in another decade, believing courage could replace technology. At night, the pilots talked about it over cigarettes. "We'll never match them head-on," one said. "We need new tactics." Another joked bitterly, "Maybe we'll just throw the torpedoes by hand." Gay didn't laugh. He watched the stars and thought about what it meant to fly a plane everyone thought was useless. It wasn't just the danger, it was the humiliation. They were being asked to do the impossible with tools that belonged in a museum. But Commander John Waldron didn't let the complaints take root. He was a solid man from Nebraska, quiet and unshakable. He told his men that they could still make a difference. "We can't control what we fly," he said during a meeting, "but we can control how we fight." He drilled them endlessly, making them practice low-altitude runs over the waves, sometimes so close their propellers kicked up spray. "If we can't be faster, we'll be smarter," he'd say. Gay respected him deeply. Waldron had an intuition for battle, a sense that went beyond the manual. When he spoke of war, it wasn't about glory, it was about doing what had to be done, even when it didn't make sense. "Someone's got to go first," he told Gay one evening after a long day of drills. "And when they go first, they don't always come back." In the weeks before Midway, the tension grew. Intelligence officers began sharing fragments of intercepted Japanese communications. There was talk of a massive strike somewhere in the Pacific. Some believed it would be against the Aleutians. Others said Midway. Gay and the others didn't know what to believe, but they felt the storm coming. Every night, they checked their planes, replaced worn cables, and tested their torpedoes again and again, even though most of them knew the Mark 13 models were unreliable. Too many times, the warheads failed to detonate or ran too deep. Still, they prepared. The hangars echoed with the clatter of wrenches, the smell of grease, and the laughter of men pretending they weren't afraid. Gay often wrote short notes to his family, though he rarely mailed them. "If I don't make it," one read, "tell them it wasn't for nothing." When the orders came to ship out on the Hornet, the mood shifted from restless boredom to grim focus. They all knew something big was coming. The carrier felt alive, humming with purpose as it steamed west. Gay spent hours on the flight deck, watching the waves peel away from the hull, thinking about the distance between life and death. The ocean seemed endless, and so did the possibilities. But as confident as they were, the pilots couldn't ignore the rumors. The Navy had intelligence suggesting the Japanese fleet was heading straight for Midway. Yet even with this knowledge, the U.S. still seemed unprepared. There were disagreements among commanders about tactics, whether to launch all planes together or stagger them. Some thought torpedo bombers should wait for dive bombers to coordinate attacks. Others argued they had to go in first. In the end, they went alone. That was the cruelest part, the vision ignored. Men like Jimmy Thatch, who had already faced the Japanese, had developed new tactics like the Thatch Weave, designed to counter the Zero's agility. But those innovations hadn't reached every squadron in time. And Torpedo 8, newly assigned to the Hornet, was operating with old orders and old assumptions. They weren't just fighting the Japanese, they were fighting their own command's inertia. Gay remembered the last night before takeoff. The mess hall was quiet. The smell of coffee mixed with oil and sweat. Some of the men played cards. Others wrote letters. Waldron walked among them, stopping to rest a hand on a shoulder or share a small smile. When he reached Gay, he said softly, "Tomorrow's going to be rough. Stay low, keep your head straight, and no matter what happens, keep going until you've done your part." Gay nodded. He wanted to ask what would happen if they failed, but he already knew the answer. The next morning came fast. The sea was calm, deceptive in its beauty. The men moved with mechanical precision, checking straps, folding maps, loading torpedoes. The sound of engines warming up filled the air. Gay could still hear Waldron's final words over the intercom. "We will attack the enemy carriers. Follow me in." But beneath those words was another truth, one nobody wanted to say aloud, that this mission wasn't just dangerous. It was suicide. The upper command hadn't fully coordinated the attacks between squadrons. The dive bombers and fighters were launched on separate bearings, chasing different leads. When Torpedo 8 took off, they were flying blind. Even so, there was no hesitation. Gay felt it in his bones, the strange peace that comes when you stop fighting the inevitable. As they flew toward the rising sun, he looked at the horizon and thought about everything that had led them there. The ignored warnings, the failed technology, the arrogance of those who believed courage could make up for everything else. And yet, he couldn't blame them entirely. America was still learning how to fight a modern war. The Navy was transforming in real time, discovering through blood what worked and what didn't. Torpedo 8 was part of that painful learning curve, a chapter written in courage and fire. Now, floating in the wreckage, Gay understood it more clearly than ever. Every mistake, every oversight, every outdated assumption had been paid for in human lives. The irony stung like salt in his wounds. They had trained to strike the enemy, but in truth, they had been sacrificed to teach their own nation how to win. As the sun climbed higher, the wreckage around him shimmered with heat. The Japanese destroyers moved farther away, chasing phantom enemies on the horizon. Gay remained still, hidden under his cushion, his eyes fixed on the sky. He didn't know it yet, but the lessons written in the smoke and blood of Torpedo 8 were about to bear fruit. Somewhere above the clouds, other squadrons were closing in, armed not just with bombs, but with the knowledge that courage alone wasn't enough. And in that bitter truth lay the seed of victory. The sun was high now, sharp and merciless. Its reflection danced across the Pacific like shattered glass. George Gay floated quietly, his body half numb, half burning. The crash had left his left leg bruised and swollen. His skin blistered from the fire, but the pain barely registered. The world had narrowed to heat, salt, and the faint rumble of distant engines. He couldn't tell if hours had passed or minutes. The horizon shimmered endlessly, and above it, smoke plumes twisted like black fingers into the sky. Somewhere out there, the Battle of Midway still raged. He lifted his head just enough to see. The Japanese carriers were still maneuvering, launching new waves of planes. The air was alive with motion. Fighters taking off, bombers circling back, destroyers zigzagging to shield their flagships. To the Japanese sailors on those decks, it must have felt like dominance. They had swatted away the American attack like gnats. Every devastator that had come in low had been obliterated. Their Zero pilots, fast and unrelenting, had torn the formations apart before a single torpedo hit. It was a massacre, but in the cruel rhythm of war, destruction has a purpose. Without realizing it, the Japanese fleet had fallen into a trap of their own confidence. Every fighter that had swooped low to intercept the devastators was now out of position. Too low, too far, too spent on fuel. Their air defense was wide open above the clouds. And that was when the next wave appeared. Far above, invisible to Gay's eyes, 3 squadrons of U.S. Navy dive bombers were crossing the sky. They had come from the Enterprise and Yorktown, flying SBD Dauntless bombers guided by Commander Wade McCluskey and Max Leslie. They had been searching desperately for the Japanese fleet, nearly out of fuel, ready to turn back. Then, by sheer instinct, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Ayrshire, racing north at full speed. He guessed it was rejoining the main fleet after chasing an American submarine. Trusting that hunch, he followed its wake. That single decision changed the war. Below them, the ocean opened up into a panorama of fire and motion. McCluskey's bombers rolled into their dives. The SBDs plummeted through the clouds, engines screaming, sunlight flashing off their canopies. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were caught in the worst possible moment. Their decks were loaded with fuel hoses and stacked bombs. Planes were being rearmed and refueled after striking Midway's island defenses. The air was thick with gasoline vapor. At 10:22 a.m., the first American bombs hit. From the surface, Gay saw it before he heard it. The sky rippled with motion, and then a blinding flash erupted on one of the carriers. A split second later came the thunder. Flames blossomed across the decks, swallowing aircraft, sailors, and steel. The explosions rolled like earthquakes across the water. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet high, turning the bright day into something apocalyptic. Gay's heart pounded. He pushed himself higher in the water, ignoring the risk of being seen. What he saw made no sense at first. The same Japanese ships that had annihilated his squadron were now burning from bow to stern. The fire moved too fast to be contained. Ammunition stored below decks began to detonate, sending debris skyward like volcanic ash. One carrier tilted sharply, its bow dipping toward the sea. The sound was deafening, metal shrieking, explosions overlapping, and the low, unending hum of destruction. Gay could feel the heat even from miles away. His cushion bobbed beneath him as waves from the distant blasts rippled outward. He covered his face, partly from the glare, partly from disbelief. From his hidden vantage point, he was witnessing something no one else in the U.S. Navy could see in real time: the turning of the tide. Torpedo Eight's suicidal run had drawn every enemy fighter to sea level, giving the dauntless bombers a clear path. In just 5 minutes, Japan's naval supremacy in the Pacific was shattered. But war doesn't pause for miracles. As the first 3 carriers burned, the last one, Hiryu, launched a desperate counterattack. Her bombers found the Yorktown and struck hard. Gay couldn't see it, but miles away, the Yorktown listed heavily, smoke pouring from her deck. The battle was a chain reaction of blows and counterblows. Both sides were bleeding, but the advantage had shifted irreversibly. Hours passed. The afternoon sun began to sink, casting a red haze over the waves. Gay's lips were cracked, his tongue dry. He tried to sip from his life vest's small rubber tube, but it was empty. His burns throbbed, his vision blurred, yet he couldn't stop staring at the distant infernos. The Japanese ships that had seemed invincible now looked fragile, broken, human. He thought of his squadron, their voices on the radio, their laughter before takeoff, their silence now. He replayed the final moments. Waldron's last transmission, the sudden fire, field scream. It came to him in flashes, like lightning in the dark. He wondered if anyone else from Torpedo 8 had survived. The sea around him gave no answer. Night began to fall. The fires on the carriers glowed like cities burning on the horizon. The stars emerged, faint against the smoke. The Japanese destroyers moved through the wreckage, rescuing their own men, firing flares, searching for survivors. Gay stayed hidden. Once, a destroyer's spotlight swept across the water near him, and he froze, holding his breath until it passed. He could hear voices, Japanese sailors shouting orders, the thrum of engines idling. He was close enough to see their faces lit by the glow of the flames. They didn't know that the lone figure drifting among the wreckage was watching history unfold. Somewhere around midnight, exhaustion took him. His body floated on instinct, his mind flickering between dreams and memory. He saw his mother's porch in Texas, his flight school graduation, the endless drills at Pearl. He saw Waldron's face again, calm and resolute. "Someone's got to go first," the commander had said. "And when they go first, they don't always come back." When dawn broke on June 5th, the world was quieter. Smoke still hung over the sea like a gray curtain. The Japanese fleet was retreating. 3 of their 4 carriers were gone, the 4th mortally wounded. Gay could smell the burning oil miles away. The surface of the ocean was littered with debris, lifeboats, fragments of aircraft, fuel drums, and bodies. He realized dimly that he had survived the impossible. The irony of it hit him hard. Out of all 30 men of Torpedo 8, he was the only one still alive. Not because he was the best pilot or the bravest, but because fate had placed him in just the right spot to witness everything. He hadn't sunk a single ship. His torpedo had likely missed. And yet his mission, his very failure, had paved the way for victory. He felt the weight of that realization sink deeper than any wound. Courage hadn't saved them. Sacrifice had. The kind of sacrifice that looked like defeat until the smoke cleared. He closed his eyes and whispered something he couldn't quite finish. A prayer, a promise, a farewell. By afternoon, he heard the distant hum of aircraft. At first, he feared it was Japanese patrols, but then he recognized the sound, slower, deeper. American PBY Catalina search planes. He tried to wave, but his arms were too weak. Hours later, when one finally spotted him, he barely had the strength to signal. The rescue crew pulled him aboard, sunburned, half-conscious, and covered in oil. Someone said, "You're lucky to be alive." He wanted to say it wasn't luck. It was something else, something harder to name. As they flew him back toward Midway, he looked out through the small window of the PBY at the burning horizon. The ocean below was still streaked with oil and smoke. In that vast expanse, he saw both victory and loss, two sides of the same truth. History would call it the turning point of the Pacific War. But to George Gay, it was the day the sky itself caught fire and refused to go out. The Catalina flying boat carried George Gay toward Midway under a pale morning sky. His burns were bandaged, his face crusted with salt, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The smoke columns twisting upward, the explosions blooming across the Japanese carriers, the men of his squadron vanishing into the sea one by one. The rescue crew said little. They had pulled several survivors that day, most of them from other squadrons, and the silence among them was heavy. When they finally reached Midway, medics lifted him gently from the plane. "You're the only one from Torpedo 8, one said quietly. The words hung in the air like a verdict. He was placed on a cot near the field hospital, still smelling of fuel and sea salt. Around him, the island buzzed with activity. Radio operators shouting coordinates, planes taking off and landing, stretchers being carried in and out. The Battle of Midway was not over. Far to the northwest, the last Japanese carrier, Hiryu, was still striking back. But Gay didn't know that yet. All he could do was listen. The radio crackled constantly with half-understood transmissions. Enemy carrier hit, fires spreading, Yorktown heavily damaged. He stared at the tense canvas ceiling and wondered if any of this could possibly be real. While he lay there, the tide of the battle turned again. After the devastating attacks on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the Japanese Navy had fought with desperate fury. The Hiryu launched 2 counterstrikes that found the Yorktown. The first wave hit with precision, bombs tearing open her flight deck, flames racing through her hangars. Damage control teams managed to keep her afloat, but then the second wave arrived, and torpedoes punched deep into her hull. By mid-afternoon, Yorktown was dead in the water. Yet her sacrifice had drawn Japanese attention long enough for the Americans to locate and destroy Hiryu in return. It was a brutal exchange. 4 Japanese carriers lost for 1 American. And for Gay, lying in a medical tent, it was the slow revelation that Torpedo Eight's death had not been in vain. Their suicidal run had pulled every zero low, clearing the sky for the dauntless dive bombers that ended Japan's dominance. In 5 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. That evening, the reports became official. The Japanese fleet was retreating. Admiral Yamamoto had ordered a full withdrawal. On Midway, exhausted sailors and Marines gathered on the beach to watch the sunset, the horizon glowing faintly with the last traces of smoke. Some cheered, some wept, and some just stared, too tired to feel anything. Gay sat on a crate near the shoreline, wrapped in a blanket. The waves lapped gently at his boots. An officer approached and crouched beside him. "You're Gay, right? The one who saw it all." He nodded slowly. "Intelligence wants to talk to you in the morning. You're the only man who witnessed the Japanese fleet up close from start to finish." The thought made him uneasy. He hadn't meant to become a witness. He'd wanted to be part of the fight, not a ghost floating between life and death. But fate had chosen differently. When the debriefing came, he sat before a table of officers and analysts, their faces serious, their pencils scratching furiously as he described everything he'd seen. The layout of the Japanese fleet, the number of carriers, the sequence of explosions. One of them asked, "Did you see any American hits before you went down?" Gay shook his head. Not before I crashed. But afterward, yes. I saw all 3 carriers burning. The room went silent. A few men exchanged glances. They realized this young pilot, sunburned and half-starved, had been the first American to witness the turning of the war. Days later, word of the victory reached the mainland. The newspapers exploded with headlines. U.S. Navy triumphs at Midway. For Japanese carriers sunk. Enemy advance halted. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the American public felt hope again. But alongside the triumph came the stories of sacrifice. One headline in particular captured attention. 30 pilots fly into death. 1 survives. Beneath it was a photo of George Gay, smiling faintly, wearing a hospital robe, his eyes still haunted. He was flown back to Pearl Harbor for recovery and then to the States for interviews. Everywhere he went, people called him a hero. Radio announcers introduced him as the man who saw the whole battle. Women handed him letters to deliver to their sons overseas. Children asked him what it felt like to be shot down. He answered politely, but inside he felt detached, almost guilty. He hadn't fired the shot that won the battle. He'd simply survived long enough to see others do it. In Washington, he met with senior officers who congratulated him for his courage under fire. They asked him to recount every detail again for the historical record. When one admiral said, "Your squadron's sacrifice saved the Pacific," Gay almost couldn't speak. He remembered Waldron's voice in the ready room, calm but final. He remembered Field's last shout before the flames took him. And he thought of the 29 men whose names would now be carved into memorials instead of payroll lists. Back at Pearl Harbor, the surviving squadrons returned to base. The Enterprise and Hornet limped in, decks scarred and patched. Sailors stood at attention as the names of the fallen were read aloud. Torpedo 8 was honored first. When Gay's name was called, a murmur went through the crowd. He was standing there, the only one still alive. The chaplain read a prayer. They gave their all so that freedom may endure. Gay's throat tightened, and he looked down, his hands trembling. He wished they wouldn't call him lucky. Over the next few weeks, he began to see how deeply Midway had shaken both sides. For Japan, it was a wound from which their navy would never recover. 4 of their 6 fleet carriers were gone, along with hundreds of experienced pilots. The myth of invincibility had been broken. For America, it was proof that they could fight and win. Factories back home accelerated production. New ships were laid down, new planes designed. The tide had truly turned. Yet victory always carried a cost. Gay spent long nights walking the docks at Pearl, staring at the stars reflected in the harbor water. Every time he heard engines overhead, his heart raced. The smell of fuel still made him sick. Once, another pilot asked if he'd fly again. Gay hesitated. "If they need me," he said finally. But inside he wasn't sure. Part of him was still out there, floating in that oil-slick sea, watching the flames. Months later, he did return to the air. He flew training missions, lectured on torpedo tactics, and helped improve communication between bomber and fighter squadrons. The lessons of Midway had reshaped the Navy. Coordination became gospel. No more isolated attacks. Every strike from then on would combine fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes in perfect timing. The blood of Torpedo 8 had rewritten the manual. By the time 1945 came and the war ended, George Gay had flown again in combat, though never another mission like Midway. He watched Japan surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri with mixed emotions: relief, pride, and a deep, unhealed ache. The victory belonged to all who had fought, but especially to those who hadn't returned. Years later, when reporters asked him what he remembered most, he never spoke first of fire or death. He spoke of the silence after the battle, the strange stillness of the ocean, the realization that the world had shifted forever. "I saw the empire burn," he said once in an interview. "But I also saw what it cost us to light that fire." The Battle of Midway became legend, taught in academies, studied by generations. Historians called it the turning of the tide. But for George Gay, it was something simpler and sadder. A moment when ordinary men, flying outdated machines, proved that courage could change history. even when it couldn't save them. As he aged, he often visited reunions and memorials, standing quietly before the plaques etched with names like Waldron, Field, and O'Flaherty. He would trace the letters with his fingers, whisper something only he could hear, then walk away. The world remembered the victory. He remembered the faces. The tide had turned that day not just in war, but in understanding. The world learned that sacrifice is not the opposite of success. Sometimes, it is the foundation of it. And as the Pacific waves rolled endlessly against the shore, George Gay carried that truth within him. A living echo of the day when one squadron flew straight into death and changed the course of history. The war had been won, but for George Gay, peace did not come easily. After the Battle of Midway, he became an accidental symbol of survival, courage, and the thin line between duty and death. The headlines called him the lone survivor of Torpedo 8, and to the public, he was a hero. But when he looked in the mirror, he didn't see one. He saw the faces of his squadron, the men who had flown beside him and never returned, and he carried them everywhere he went. The Navy brought him home for a brief leave. He traveled from base to base, speaking at events, shaking hands, and answering the same question over and over. What was it like? The crowds wanted stories of glory, of daring attacks and narrow escapes. He tried to give them what they wanted, describing the torpedo run, the flak, the moment his plane hit the sea. But he never talked about the screaming, the smell of burning flesh, or the silence afterward. Those belonged to him alone. At night, in the quiet of hotel rooms or officers' quarters, he would wake drenched in sweat, his heart pounding from dreams of the ocean on fire. He was invited to the White House once to meet senior officials. They congratulated him, presented him with a medal, and praised his extraordinary bravery. The words felt hollow. He remembered Commander Waldron's final order, "Follow me in," and the 30 voices that had answered. He thought of how each of those men had believed they were part of something bigger, something worth dying for. Now he was the only one left to remember them. When the war continued in the Pacific, Gay asked to return to combat. "I'm no good at speeches," he told his superiors. "I belong in the air." They agreed, and he was reassigned to training and later to operational patrols. This time, he flew newer aircraft, sleek, fast, powerful machines that made the old Devastator seem like a toy. The Navy had learned. Every new plane, every revised tactic, carried a trace of Midway's lesson. The blood of Torpedo 8 had not been wasted. He helped train younger pilots, men barely out of high school, eager for action. During briefings, he told them bluntly, "Technology wins battles, but courage wins wars. You need both." Some of them knew who he was and watched him with awe, whispering his name as if he were made of legend. But Gay never encouraged the worship. He made them study maps, practice torpedo runs, rehearse coordination with fighters and dive bombers. He wanted them to survive. When the war finally ended in 1945, Gay was 30 years old. He stood among crowds in Pearl Harbor watching fireworks light the night sky. Sailors danced, strangers hugged, and bands played "God Bless America." But inside he felt hollow. He thought of the ocean again, of the calm blue water turned red by flame and blood. He thought of Waldron, of Field, of all the boys who hadn't made it home to see this victory. He wanted to celebrate, but every cheer reminded him of who wasn't there. Back home, reporters still sought him out. They wanted his version of Midway, his insider's account. He wrote a few articles, careful to honor the truth without glorifying the horror. Eventually, he decided to tell the full story himself. In the late 1940s, he began writing a memoir, not as a boast but as a testimony. He titled it Sole Survivor. It wasn't filled with military jargon or heroics. It was raw, human, honest. He described the smell of aviation gas, the feel of the cockpit vibrating, the sight of his comrades burning as they fell into the sea. He wanted people to understand that victory had a face, and it was often covered in oil and blood. When the book was published, veterans wrote to him, thanking him for giving voice to their own ghosts. Some couldn't finish reading it. "It's too close," one letter said. "Too real." Gay didn't mind. He hadn't written it for comfort. He had written it so the world would remember that war isn't glory, it's sacrifice. In the years that followed, he stayed connected to the Navy, working as a flight instructor and later as a commercial pilot. But he never truly escaped the shadow of Midway. Whenever he was introduced at events, the same phrase followed his name, the lone survivor. He smiled politely, shook hands, posed for photos, but inside, he flinched every time. Being called a survivor meant reliving that morning. It meant remembering the way the sun rose over the Pacific, how 30 planes had taken off and only his head returned. Time has a way of softening the noise of history, but it never truly silences it. For George Gay, the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire from that morning in 1942 never disappeared. They only faded into the background of ordinary life. He lived long enough to see the world that his generation had saved grow comfortable, distracted, and sometimes forgetful. But whenever he spoke about Midway, the years dissolved. His voice would slow, his eyes would sharpen, and the Pacific would come back into focus. The heat, the light, the sound of courage breaking the silence of fear. By the 1970s, Gay had become something of a living relic. He gave interviews to television networks, participated in documentaries, and attended anniversary commemorations. Yet he never played the celebrity. When asked how it felt to be the last man of Torpedo 8, he would usually smile gently and say, "I was just doing my job." But behind those modest words was a lifetime of reflection. He had spent decades trying to make sense of why he had lived when all the others had perished. The answer, he realized, was not in heroism, it was in memory. His duty hadn't ended when the war did. It had simply changed. He had become a storyteller, a guardian of names that would otherwise fade into statistics. He often carried a small notebook with him, filled with details about his fallen squadron mates, where they were from, what they liked, who they left behind. At reunions or museum events, he would take it out and read from it quietly, almost like a prayer. Ensign O'Flaherty, Nebraska, loved baseball, could outfly any of us in a crosswind. Lieutenant Commander Waldron, Nebraska farm boy, toughest man I ever met. The crowds listened, transfixed, realizing that the story of Midway wasn't about one man's survival. It was about an entire generation's willingness to give everything. In 1980, Gay was invited to speak at the Naval War College. He stood before an audience of officers and cadets, most of whom weren't born when Midway was fought. His opening words were simple. "We didn't win because we were better. We won because we refused to quit." He spoke about the arrogance of underestimating an enemy, about the cost of learning too late, and about the power of leadership that inspires men to fly straight into impossible odds. "When I see young aviators today," he told them, "I see the faces of my friends. You owe them more than remembrance. You owe them preparation." The room was silent. When he finished, the officers rose in applause, but Gay didn't smile. He knew applause couldn't bring back the men whose courage had bought that lesson. He left the hall quietly afterward, the echo of clapping fading behind him like a wave receding on the shore. As the decades rolled on, Midway's legacy only grew. Historians called it the most decisive naval battle of the 20th century. Documentaries and films immortalized the heroism of the pilots who flew into near-certain death. Yet what fascinated Gay most was how history often forgot the human side of that victory. "People remember ships," he once said, "but I remember faces." When filmmakers asked to use his story, he always insisted that the names of the other men be mentioned first. "They're the story," he'd say. "I just happened to come home." In his later years, he traveled frequently to memorial dedications. At one in San Diego, he stood beside a restored TBD Devastator, a rare survivor of its kind. The plane's metal gleamed in the California sun, its wings folded like a resting bird. Gay reached out and touched its side, tracing the rivets with his fingertips. "You got us there," he whispered, "even when the world said you couldn't." Nearby, a young boy asked his father who the old man was. The father replied softly, "That's the pilot who saw it all." Gay turned toward them and smiled. "No, son," he said gently. "I only saw a part. The rest belongs to the ones who didn't come back." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the gravity in the man's tone. That moment, captured by a local newspaper photographer, became one of the most circulated images of the Midway anniversary. A veteran, weathered and humble, touching the machine that had carried him through fire. As age caught up with him, his public appearances grew fewer, but his voice remained steady. In one of his final interviews, he was asked whether he believed fate had chosen him. He shook his head. "No one's chosen," he said. "We all get our orders. Some of us finish them in one day. Some take a lifetime." Then, after a long pause, he added, "Maybe my order was to remember." He spent his final years writing letters to schools and veterans organizations, reminding people that history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to keep alive. He encouraged teachers to tell their students about the cost of freedom, not as a lecture but as a story. "If you make them feel it," he wrote, "they'll never forget it." In 1992, on the 50th anniversary of Midway, Gay returned to the island one last time. The U.S. Navy had organized a commemorative ceremony, bringing together veterans, historians, and sailors from a new generation. The airstrip was still there, weathered but intact, and the coral reefs shimmered beneath the waves just as they had half a century earlier. Gay stood near the edge of the runway, the same kind of runway from which his squadron had once launched into immortality. He looked out at the horizon, where sea and sky met in a perfect line, and closed his eyes. For a moment, he could almost hear it again, the engines roaring to life, the shouted orders, the smell of fuel thick in the air. He saw Waldron turning back from his cockpit, nodding once before takeoff. He saw Fields grin, fearless and defiant, and he felt the old weight in his chest, the mixture of fear and faith that had defined that morning. When he spoke at the ceremony, his voice trembled, but his words carried the same quiet strength that had guided him through the war. 50 years ago, we were young, scared, and outmatched, but we had something that can't be built in a factory. We had belief in each other, in our country, and in the idea that even if we didn't come back, what we did would matter. And it did. It still does. The crowd stood in silence. The Pacific breeze moved through the flags and the palms, carrying the scent of salt and memory. When he finished, the Navy band began to play Eternal Father, Strong to Save, and Gay turned his gaze back to the sea. He whispered the names of his squadron under his breath, one by one, until the music drowned his voice. 2 years later, George Gay passed away peacefully in his sleep. The news spread quietly, like the fading echo of an old song. Newspapers ran obituaries with titles like "The Last Witness of Midway" and "Lone Survivor Flies Home." His funeral drew both veterans and young aviators, all standing together as the honor guard fired its salute. When the missing man formation soared overhead, 4 planes in tight formation, one pulling upward into the clouds. Every head tilted skyward, following the lone aircraft as it disappeared into the sun. Afterward, his daughter found his old notebook on his desk. Inside were the same names he had carried for 50 years, written carefully in ink that had faded with time. At the bottom of the last page, he had added a final line: "We did our duty. We did not die in vain." Today, visitors to the Midway Museum and Naval Archives still read his story. His words, his photographs, his interviews. They remain steady and unflinching reminders of what it means to face the impossible. Students who watch his old film reels or read Soul Survivor are often struck by his humility. He never called himself a hero, and perhaps that's what made him one. The legacy of George Gay is not only in history books but in the enduring spirit of everyone who learns his name. He proved that one man's witness can keep a generation's sacrifice alive. His flight, his fall, and his survival became a symbol of a nation's awakening, the moment when courage rose above despair, and the Pacific began to turn. Even now, the ocean he once drifted upon keeps its quiet rhythm, endless and indifferent. But above those same waters, aircraft still carve their trails through the sky, and on their wings is written the silent promise that men like George Gay made long ago: that freedom, though fragile and costly, is worth every drop of courage it demands. And somewhere in the wind that crosses that endless sea, You can almost hear it, the echo of engines, the heartbeat of sacrifice, and the whispered truth that he left behind. That the measure of a life is not how long it lasts, but how deeply it remembers.